me, one of the parts of the conversation that's often overlooked is how does gender-based violence affect our children?
Mm-hmm.
And it's important because sometimes we don't intervene because we say a man and woman argument, so we're not getting involved. But I feel if you know children are being affected, we may
Right.
become a little more concerned.
Right.
So from your perspective, just how much does gender-based violence come to bear on our children?
All right. So for me, it comes to bear in two primary ways, or at two levels. So first, you have the secondary trauma, which is experienced when a child lives in a home or lives in a community where they're seeing gender-based violence perpetuated, more often than not, the man upon the woman. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't have instances where it is the female who is the aggressor, who is taking advantage of whatever weakness or vulnerability that the man in that context has. And so what we're seeing in these circumstances is that there is no primary trauma, so to speak, but the secondary trauma is very real. And if you have children living in a toxic environment where there's this kind of violence being perpetrated between adults, sometimes adults that the child cares about, so they care about mommy, they care about daddy, and they're seeing this happen, then you're going to have the emotional and psychological impact, which is in fact child abuse as well, albeit a different category, that is going to negatively impair that child's ability to cope with the confusion, with the anger that comes sometimes, and with the sense of helplessness that they can't do anything to interrupt this violence or change it. And also sometimes that's accompanied by guilt. You know, why is this happening? Some of them internalize and think that perhaps the parents are staying together because of them, the child, you know, the traditional thing, we stay together for the children, but they see the harm that's you know, inflicting at that level. So there is that very real issue that has to be dealt with. And what we find is that especially where there are, you know, guilt issues and the children feel as if they're a part of the problem, this secondary trauma is not dealt with because sometimes they don't talk about it very readily. There is the embarrassment and shame that goes along with disclosing to anybody that you live in this type of household. And so you have these children who suffer in silence, and that has long-term effects on their ability to socially regulate and deal with situations when they become adults. What research tells us is that typically a female child who is in that kind of environment, when she becomes an adult and starts negotiating, you know, intimate relationships of her own, she's more prone and more open to receiving violence because she would have seen this. And so statistically, she's more predisposed to herself becoming a victim of domestic violence. And the opposite happens for boys who are in this situation. And of course, these are just typical things. It doesn't say that every child who is in this situation will have this reality. But boys end up being the power brokers in their own relationships when they start navigating intimacy. And we see, again, statistically, a predisposition to them being perpetrators of abuse in their own relationships. There are the smaller cases as well in terms of category, where again, the violence is not directed at the child, it's between adults. But sometimes we find, especially I was looking at some instances out of South Africa, and I'm sure they're here as well, where the child is used as the shield. So mommy sees daddy coming at her with a weapon, and in a bid to disrupt or abort the assault that she anticipates, she puts the child in the way, thinking that you love your child, there's no way you'd hit this child. But in the fit of rage, the child does in fact end up sustaining physical blows. So there are those instances as well where, you know, we have that kind of direct impact. Also, I just want to mention, Dahlia, that in the review of statistics, if you will, taking gender-based violence now to the level of, you know, the kinds of abuses that we see children in terms of their gender being more predisposed to, I think there still needs to be some specific research to see if it can be properly classified as gender-based violence, because, you know, there is a very forensic definition of what gender-based violence is. It's when you're targeted because of your gender and you suffer these various acts of abuse. What is very obvious is that when we're talking about child trafficking, we find that girls are more predisposed to sexual exploitation and boys more predisposed to fall prey to labor exploitation. And so you wonder if girls are targeted because they're seen as more physically vulnerable, so it's easier to exploit them sexually, and boys are targeted for labor exploitation because of the traditional thing about brawn and strength and ability to work long hours. So, yeah. So those are the levels I wanted to talk about.
I want to go back to what you said in terms of the primary and secondary exposure to the violence, because there are instances when we've seen them recently in the papers where the child ends up being the target of the violence as well, or the child and the mother. In instances like that, how does the OCA, intervene? How do you step in to protect the child?
All right, so usually it's a support situation. So if, for example, it's the mother who is the primary target and the child just happens to be a package deal, there is the intervention that can be provided in the form of support. So if that child, for example, through the mother, typically that's how the situation will come to our attention, needs any kind of psychosocial support, we would play coordinating support roles with other entities, to include the CPFSA, the National Parenting Support Commission. And in fact, there are private shelters. For example, Women's Inc. has been very, very much a trailblazer in this area, having a shelter even before our very own national shelter that provides that kind of temporary, safe space for mother and child, which would cover, of course, the physical and the need to have any kind of psychosocial support. What is important as well is that if the matter is placed before the court, and again, not many of these matters, I would say that the large percentage of these matters don't end up in court because of the complex issues and the emotional issues that are involved. Sometimes you find women don't go through with it. Even if they come out of the situation, they're not going through the formal process to say, let's go to court and do the long haul. But where those matters do end up in court, then through the OCA's legal department, we can provide support services to the child, so the child understands what's happening through the legal system, can better cope with what are some of the possible orders that may be made, and that kind of satellite kind of care that would be provided.
Yeah, because I'm thinking if I live in a community and I know that a child is being abused in that way, and it's part of this cycle, but the mother is not empowered to do it. I want to know that as a citizen, I can pick up the phone and say, listen, somebody come save this child. Do you find that there are a lot of children in our own state care, and people who have gone through foster care that are coming out of situations of gender-based violence?
Again, the statistics are not as clear-cut for me to say that definitively, but just based on how things happen at the societal level and my own observation, I think that this is a very probable inference that we can draw. Gender-based violence is really all over our society. And so it would be very unusual for me to find that there are these vulnerable circumstances that warrant children being taken out of these toxic environments that wouldn't have some kind of interplay with gender-based violence in these instances. When you think about some of the stories even that you hear from the children, they see mommy and daddy fighting, or they hear them fighting all the time, or because mommy does something, daddy vex. So the child almost starts excusing the violence that they're seeing as a normal part of these adult relationships.
Yeah, and I've heard situations where they've said, mommy had to run. We keep hiding from daddy, and so mommy leave me somewhere, and where I was left, I was abused, or I was left here and then I have to run away. And so I find, Diahann, that our tendency to not want to get involved because of big people business. It's not just big people's business. We have to get involved. because of how it affects our children. Makes
Absolutely.
them very
Absolutely. It puts them at both physical and emotional and psychological risk. And if risks are not dealt with in a timely way, then of course these compound the adverse childhood experiences that children are exposed to, which has a long-term negative impact for them and for us as a society, because we're the ones that will be left with that social bill, if you will, to help repair these children who will grow up into dysfunctional adults. So you're absolutely right.
Yeah, I had an interesting discussion with Alexander Williams from the Bar Association, and he was sharing with me just some of the ways in which the law protects our women that a lot of us are not aware of. Right. Are there any ways in which the laws protect children that you want to share with us that many of us may not even know? In terms of gender-based violence and domestic violence.
Yes. All right, so here I'll piggyback a little bit on what Alexander may have shared with you. So under the Domestic Violence Act, you know, for example, that a woman can get, or anybody, let me not say a woman, an abused partner who is in a relationship can get relief from the court. For example, we have the protection orders and we have the occupation orders. Now, the occupation orders, I think, would be the one that would be most on all fours with how a child could benefit. And I'm drawing this analogy, Dahlia, because there isn't any explicit kind of remedy that's available for a child within the current legal framework. But under the Domestic Violence Act, the occupation order entitles someone who is in an abusive relationship to go to the court to get exclusive right to occupy the primary place of residence, thereby putting out the perpetrator. So of course, if it's a situation where there are children in the picture, this gives the children the opportunity to remain in the primary home, the family home, the matrimonial home, without having his or her life disrupted because of the gender-based violence that the victim, the adult victim, was being exposed to in this situation. So that's one of the remedies that would extend to children. What I can share with you, though, is that the Domestic Violence Act, along with a number of other pieces of legislation, have come up for review by a Joint Select Committee of Parliament that was looking at a suite of statutes that would look at the vulnerable in our society. And one of the submissions that I made, having been invited to contribute to that debate, was that domestic violence situations among adults should be extended to be included in the Child Care and Protection Act as one of those circumstances that would make a child be deemed as being in need of care and protection, as defined by Section 8 of the Child Care and Protection Act, because of these very issues that we're discussing. So if a child is in that kind of physical environment, then obviously it has to be that that child has to be in need of care and protection. You know, so that was one of the submissions that has been made. The act still has not been fully, the reforms have not been completed, but that's one of them that I will be, sticking to, because I think it's absolutely important that we, kind of include this. Another submission which would benefit children is for the Domestic Violence Act to include what I classify as financial abuse, which is where the breadwinner in the family uses his or her financial power as, a shelter or a stick over the head of the other one who is dependent, and uses this now to ensure that that person remains submissive, remains party to the abuse, and willingly receives it because they're financially dependent on the primary breadwinner. And so I think that if this is included as well, it will assist a lot of persons who stay in relationships and take the blows or the exploitation because they can't manage to provide for themselves or for their children, otherwise than staying in there. So again, this extension, I think, would of course clearly benefit children.
It will make a world of a difference, Dan. If there's any way that as the public we can help in getting it passed, in trying to advocate for it, just let us know, because 16 days of activism we can do it. Thank you so much for all you do and for speaking with us today.
Thank you for having me, Dahlia, and all the best with this. I look forward to the 16 days and to just the general unfolding of this initiative.